I'm Lori Kirkstead, and this is The Imposter's Guide to Authentic Leadership, a podcast for new leaders who are ready to stop depending on external approval and start trusting themselves. This series is based on my book of the same name, so if anything you hear speaks to you and you want to go a little bit deeper, that's the next place to go for more context and to do the leadership activity prompts. Now, this podcast is for people who got promoted because they were great at their jobs, and then they realized that leadership felt less like an accomplishment and much more like starting over. Okay, so in the last episode, we talked about the third transition, which is that sneaky one where one day you're a teammate and the next day you're the boss. And nobody really prepares you for how weird and lonely that shift can feel. So today we're on the fourth and final transition, and this one tends to hit after you've already figured out the other three. Like you've done the work, you've made peace with letting go of the doing, and you've started owning decisions. You've found your footing with the team, basically, and you feel like you finally know who you are as a leader. But then the system shows up. What do I mean by that? Well, let me tell you an example. When I got my first real leadership role, I walked in with a very clear picture of who I wanted to be. Someone who led with empathy and honesty, and who protected her team, who always made space for good ideas, who basically was like breaking the cycle of bad managers that I'd experienced myself. I'd had values and my intentions, and I guess I genuinely believed that knowing what I stood for would be enough to hold on to it. But what I didn't account for was how much of the environment was going to push back on me. You know, it started small and kind of invisible at first, where priorities would flip overnight with really no explanation. So like the project everyone was told was critical suddenly wasn't. And meetings turned into strange performances where people talked in circles and we never actually landed anywhere. And I'd pitch an idea and maybe get some polite nods and then watch someone more senior repeat the exact same thing 2 weeks later and get full credit for it. Certain people were consistently heard, while others were consistently talked over. Some got credited, while others basically disappeared from the story entirely, even if it started with them. And I really started to notice these patterns in a way that I couldn't unsee them. What I thought would be pretty straightforward turned out to be deeply, deeply complicated. And I guess somewhere in the middle of it, I realized I wasn't just doing the job anymore. I was operating inside a structure, and that structure had its own incentives and politics and blind spots, and I didn't understand any of this when I accepted the title. It came into the sharpest focus when my company went through not one, not two, but 3 rounds of restructuring in a pretty rapid succession. So teams were reshuffled, reporting lines changed, roles got redefined with very little warning, and my direct report started coming to me scared and asking whether they would have a job tomorrow. You know, a lot of the time I didn't have any answers. Sometimes I found out about the decisions that affected the team at the very same time they did. That's kind of a special feeling of awful when you're the person they're looking to for stability and you don't have any information. You know, at one point, something that happened to me was one of my strongest performers got reassigned to a different part of the org with no real conversation about what she contributed or why it mattered if she would stay on my team. The decision had been made in a meeting I wasn't a part of, and it got handed down as a done deal. So I had to sit across from this person in a one-on-one and watch her face just absolutely fall and try to answer her questions with basically nothing useful to say. The gap right there between being responsible for keeping people, steady and having very limited influence over the decisions of creating that instability. Again, this is one of the loneliest places to be in leadership. It's where the fourth transition really lives because it forces you to confront something that you've been avoiding. What actually happens to your values when the system starts pushing back against them? Because that system is going to shape you, whether you intend to let it to or not. And I want to be really honest about what that looks like because it's not going to show up in this dramatic single event. It usually doesn't show up as a big moment where you have to decide who you are. In my opinion, it shows up in like a sentence you soften before you say it out loud. A conversation you keep telling yourself you'll have later when the timing's better, and then it never quite happens. A moment where you go along with something because pushing back feels like just too much, and honestly, you're tired and you have 17 other things on your plate, and this particular hill doesn't seem worth dying on. Some of those moments are, I think, genuinely fine. You do have to pick your battles. You do have to stay in the game, but some of those moments will leave, let's say, a residue, like a low-grade discomfort that follows you home and it sits with you in a way that you really can't name. But really, those are the ones worth paying attention to because they're pointing at something you fully haven't recognized yet. For people pleasers and fawners like myself, this transition is particularly disorienting because adaptation has always been the superpower. You get super good at reading the environment about what's needed and becoming that thing. And for a long time, that skill worked. So you kept doing it. It kept you safe. It got you promoted. But leadership asks you to stop adapting yourself to the room and start actually standing for something, even when the room isn't rewarding you for it, even when no one's watching, and even when it costs you something real. That is a completely different ask than anything the fawn response has ever prepared you for. And figuring out where your actual line is, not where you think it should be in theory, but where it actually is in practice, that tends to be the real work of the whole transition. For me, the line was treating people like human beings instead of resources to be managed, which I know that sounds embarrassingly basic, but when everything around you is being measured in output and efficiency and headcount optimization, choosing to lead with humanity over and over again is actually a pretty deliberate act. You won't always be popular because of it, and it might make you look like you're not playing the game the right way, but every time the system pushed, that refusal to let it flatten the people inside of it, that's what I kept coming back to. And over time, it stopped feeling like resistance and really started feeling like who I was. The goal of this episode isn't to make you paranoid about your organization or convince you that every system is broken, because it's not true and it's also not helpful. The goal is to help you be honest with yourself before the pressure builds to the point where you're making compromises you didn't fully choose, because the leaders who come out of this transition with their values intact aren't the ones who never got pushed. They're the ones who knew what they were protecting before the pushing started. Okay, so before we get into the next episode, here's something worth sitting with. Think about a moment in the last few months where something at work left that low, uncomfortable hum. Not like a catastrophic thing, and it could even be something pretty small. But what did you do with it? Did you say something, or did you let it pass because it felt easier? And if you let it pass, is that still the trade you want to be making? In the next episode, we're shifting gears and getting into the part of the book that's about authentic leadership itself. So what it actually means, where it starts, and why the version of it that gets thrown around in corporate trainings is pretty much useless until you understand the paradox that's sitting right in the middle of it. As always, this podcast is just a peek at the book, which has the full framework by Dr. Bill George and the exercises that go with it. You can find more information about where to buy it in the show notes, and if you know a new leader who needs to hear this, please send it their way. It really does help get the word out. All right, that's it for episode 5. I am so glad you're here. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.